Welcome back for the panel discussion on speculative presences with, as Samuel already announced, 2 speakers instead of 3, because Eric Bourdelot already presented his talk on Thursday evening at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. Our first speaker is someone whom I already thanked yesterday morning in my introduction, because she helped me a lot with finding the speakers, of conceiving the overall theme of this conference. She was of invaluable help for the whole organization. Adi Efal, a research fellow right now at the St. Thomas Institute of the...
They don't say St. Thomas.
No?
They say just Thomas.
But it's still, it is still the
but
Thomas.
They are still very Catholic.
Yeah. Yes, okay. So the Thomas Institute of the University of Cologne. And she wrote a book on Panofsky. It's not yet out. It's not out there yet. But in any case, she's one of the rare people in art history who have always had an interest in questions of speculative philosophy, I suppose. So I'm very proud that she's here. Please.
Thank you, Sjord, for this nice, sweet introduction. I would like also to thank you for creating this event. So this is the first mark that I'm not, yes. I do believe that it is an important one, the conference that we are taking part in. Though I must say that since 2 days, I'm more and more thinking that it's only the beginning. It seems to me that there is so much work of clarification and distinction, methodic distinctions that we have to do in order to proceed with what we want to find out about. So many thanks for making that happen. The paper, so I needed, in a way, to concentrate a lot of material in 2,300 words, and therefore I left a lot of things outside. And then I heard 3 days ago that actually we have time. So more time to think and discuss and elaborate. So this is very comic. But so I decided not to revise the paper, but I will just have the occasion, which is not always the case, to read very slowly, which is also quite nice in conferences. And then we will have more time perhaps to discuss. You are very welcome to ask informative or other questions. So. It's okay like this? My words here are intended to serve as an introduction to the concept of habitude, taking as a starting point Félix Ravaisson's juvenile doctoral essay, De l'Habitude, of 1838. I will naturally have to limit my words to what the framework allows, and I will have to put aside many essential data and elements. And therefore, it is only upon concluding that I will be able to refer to the domain of art and to hint how the concept of habitude would be applicable to the question of the past reality of things. But I hope that the methodic, conceptual introduction would prove to be entertaining enough in its own right. Any responsible reconstruction of the history of French philosophy of the turn of the century before last should save considerable importance to the figure of Ravaisson. The ones familiar with the Bergsonian corpus would probably remember a 1904 essay dedicated to the work of Ravaisson, which was published in La Pensée et l'Émouvante in 1934. Not in any way a sole or ultimate source for Bergson's work, it is nevertheless unquestionable that Bergson owes substantial parts of his thought to the writings of Ravaisson, and that a nuanced line of dialogue exists between the works of the two philosophers. Though essential difference still lie between the two, it is permissible to read the work of Bergson through the Ravaissonian perspective and to refer to the two as establishing a genre of thought, as Dominique Janicot did already in 1969 in his book Une généalogie du spiritualisme français. I would like to dedicate a few words of introduction to a definition of the spiritualist genre of thought, as I believe it is rather important in order to discuss the question of habitude, in fact. Spiritualism is not the French version of idealism, nor is it a kind of a New Ageist messianism. The best way, it seems, to understand French spiritualism, or one of the best ways to understand it, is in the light of Cartesianism. That is to say, what characterizes metaphysically the spiritualist position is its interest in the protection of the exclusive and active position of the spirit, as really distinguished from an extended res. The spiritualist care for the spirit has also theological aspect that we'll have to leave aside. But thinkers as Descartes, Malebranche, Pascal, Biran, Alain, Bergson, and indeed, more recently, in my opinion, also Badiou, have been occupied with the revendication of the res cogitans, whose special capacity is to adhere to truth and to distinguish them, and which is described in spiritualism as free and undivisible. Naturally, not all the texts written in France in the 19th or the 20th centuries should be considered under the label of spiritualism. Nevertheless, paying attention to the impact of this genre of thought has been having in French written texts since the 19th century is one of the keys to approach what Badiou recently called the adventure of French philosophy. When one goes through this generic lineage of spiritualism, one sees that many of the authors which could be considered as pertaining to this tradition were occupied with the localization and the protection of the gentle yet elusive res cogitans. How to make a place for thought, how to wrap it and dress it, how to give it a territory or a body in which it could find its intimate freedom of producing its subtle distinctions. This is a constant leitmotif of the spiritualist tradition. And indeed, when I say giving a body or dressing the res cogitans, I am not talking metaphorically, but rather describing things as they are. Now, this dressing of this res cogitans seems to me one of the best ways to approach the concept and the problem of habitude. Indeed, in many Latin, Old French, or Old English lexicons, you'll find that one of the possible meaning of habit is also simply a cloth. More specifically, at most times, the cloth of the monk. Thus, assuming the habit or taking off the habit stand for becoming or ceasing to be a monk. The meaning of habit as cloth goes all the way back to the metaphysics delta, where Aristotle gave the relation between the wearer and her cloth as a demonstration of hexis, which is the Greek original word for the Latin habitus. Therefore, hexis habitus is a case of bilateral possession. The bearer owns and possesses her cloth, but the cloth also possesses its bearer within itself and below itself, giving the wearer not only its place in reality, but also its special task. In other words, the cloth possesses the bearer as its subject. The bearer or the wearer, on the other hand, possesses her hexis or her habitus as her place, her cover, her skin, her second skin, her makeup, in other words, her figure. As Aquinas Saint Thomas Aquinas emphasized in the 13th century, habitus, hexis. So here I left aside a whole very, very big chapter regarding the systematization of habitus by Thomas, which is an extremely, extremely fascinating Geschichte, but I will not have the time to present it here. So as Aquinas emphasized in the 13th century, habitus hexis is derived in Greek from the verb ekein, and in Latin from the verb habere, both meaning to have. Habitus hexis is therefore a bilateral possession or exchanged ownership between a wearer and her cover. Both in Aristotle and later in the scholastic tradition, hexis habitus was considered as the basis for morals and the foundation of virtue. As such, every virtue supposes a habitus in its foundation. Habitus as an acquired and possessed active capacity serves as the core of moral life and therefore of character, ethos. Habitus, as indeed Aquinas meticulously demonstrated, is essentially bounded with actions. The principal manner to establish a habitus is by an action, and at most times a single action is not enough. As Aristotle famously said regarding hexis, actually, one beard does not bring the spring. One has instead to repeat an action in order to establish and maintain a habitus, and this repetition must, in the beginning at least, involve effort. Most accounts of hexis habitus emphasizes its resistance. It is considered as a capacity that by the process of repetition and layered sedimentation becomes resistant to change. When a habitude is therefore contracted by a subject, it then functions as a second nature, a fixed disposition, which sometimes, when one wishes it to be away with, nevertheless stays around its wearer, sometimes practically impossible to change, sometimes suffocating the subject's vitality. Indeed, it was Descartes who noticed how much effort thought needs to invest in order to resist the temptation of repetition of prejudices and accepted mental habits. Jumping very quickly, what happened in the 19th century is that the essential relation between habitus and action was readdressed. Already in the first years of the 19th century, Mount de Biran found that repeated action is not only the foundation, but also could also be a danger of habitus, in the sense that a careless, effortless, automatic repetition can diminish and even destroy a habitus. Biran understood that something which has to do with the function of repetition regarding habitus must be recalibrated. If thought cannot do without an ethos, without established theories of assumptions, it cannot either, on the other hand, allow itself to rely solely on that which is already established. Therefore, the theory of habitude developed as a theory of tension. It is the tension between two dangers which constantly accompany human moral comportment. On the one hand, the danger of disintegration caused by a too automatic repetition, getting near to machinic action. On the other, the danger of rigidity and the impossibility to change a habitus which is too deeply sedimented. Both problems to be found within the habitudinal dynamics have to do with the fact that in both cases, the action of thought is not being given the right space and the right seat to take place. Therefore, the question is how to maintain the habitudinal tension. Habitude must not lose the grip of the reality to which it is directed. In other words, habitude is found to be functioning as a maintenance of desire, a tension between the organism, it's very funny regarding Reza's talk yesterday, a tension between the organism and its outside. And the savoir-faire of habitude is to maintain a desire, that is to say, a capacity to receive, to contract a certain form or operation. Habitude, therefore, involves necessarily a relation between the organism and its exterior. This calls for clarification. In the Latin text, also in philosophical lexicons, one finds a differentiation between habitus and habitudo. This differentiation is crucial. Habitudo, very simply, is a formalizable relation. One could simply call it proportion, actually. For example, the quantifiable relation between 2 and 6, which is 3, is simply in Latin a habitudo 3. You could find this usage even as late as in Descartes' Regulé. This habitudo is differentiated from habitus, which was determined as related to the moral systematization of virtue. Now, what happens in Ravaisson is that he unified, or at least conjuncted, the two meanings, the proportional and the moral meanings of habitus. In this way, he performs a process one could refer to as a naturalization, in order not to speak of ontologization, because this is not longer a valid term for me at least, naturalization of habitus. Here is how Ravaisson opens his little essay. I translated from the French, it sounds very bad in English. In the most extended sense, habitude is a general and permanent manner of being, the situation of an existence considered either in the ensemble of its elements or in the succession of its epochs, or the succession of its periods, perhaps better to say. Habitude, then, as Ravaisson presents it, is the kern of duration. Ravaisson's great expertise, beside antique sculpture, was the philosophy of Aristotle, that he researched and defended throughout his life. While forming his own version of habitude, Ravaisson was compositing Aristotelism with many other influences like British empiricism, French medical thought, Mander-Biran, and probably also the work of Schelling. But still, the Aristotelian foundation of the concept of habitude in Ravaisson is the prominent one. The danger of automatic repetition delineated by Biran is found by Ravaisson actually to be a gate, a secret, obscure door which is opened by any of our most ordinary actions and gestures, a gate to descend into the depth of the non-conscious web of installations of both our soul and body. The acquisition and then the contraction of a habitude is caused for Ravaisson essentially by a change, a changement. A change which is experienced by the organism as an alien reality, as something arriving to the organism from the outside to which the organism must react, either accept or reject or absorb or scrutinize or eat, as we learned yesterday. When this change itself is contracted, interiorized by the organism by a repetitive act, containing both the mimesis of the change and its own gestural reaction toward that change, a process of habituation takes place. This process' first element is effort. When effort is gone, also the habitudinal tension cannot survive. The tension of effort constitute an obscure activity, that is Ravaisson term, activité obscure, which when followed by the fine-tuned by the various acts of repetition and adherence can lead by a tangent and only by a tangent to a point of elementary splitting between nature and the will. Thus, habitus is primarily a retrograde movement. One cannot advance in the construction of habitude without descending deeper into the infinitesimal nuances of matter, which is always, to some extent, obscure. Perhaps it is here the proper point to halt the conceptual introduction and suggest in what manner the concept of habitude leads to the questions of art. Ravaisson's biography is marked by artistic occupations. He was an amateur painter wrote several treatises on art theory, and served also between 1870 and 1886 as the curator of antique and modern sculpture at the Louvre. I could only briefly hint to the central points constituting the crossing points between his concept of habitude and the domain of art history and theory. The concept of habitude, if taken in its extended sense, supplies an approach to the res extensa. The res extensa is approachable to the human mind by the movement, shaping, maintaining of its habitudes. As Deleuze pointed out, in fact, our bodies, all bodies, organic and inorganic, are condensed reservoirs of habitudes. The habitudinal reality, whose beats extend and contract simultaneously, can degrade one, take one down lower and lower, deep and deeper into his or her own extended reality. Therefore, the effort of habitude is necessarily also a movement into the past. One's past within this framework is radically synonymous to one's body. One's past within this framework is radically synonymous to one's body. And it is by habitude that one could approach both. This habitudinal domain is extended and therefore material, but also, of course, dynamic, as it is based on actions and tension and effort. But from here one arrives to the domain of art history, the history of material artworks. Could one view the history of art as participating in the dynamics of habitude? My view is that indeed that is the case. In this framework, it is through art history that one actually approaches the question of art itself. In that sense, art history precedes art, and not vice versa. This leads to the possibility to consider the art itself also as a habitude, an idea which was rather accepted, by the way, in the Aristotelian and scholastic tradition. Thus, bakers, pharmacists, art historians, philosophers, and artists, and all other producers capable of contracting the past through appropriation of repeating gestures, all these participate in the extended habitudinal reality. And at any moment, by many means, some of them artistic, only some of them artistic, it is possible to sample this reality by adhering to some human work. When one adheres to a work, the habitudinal perspective suggests that he actually wears the work as a second nature, as a cloth. This, so I think, produces what could be termed a figure. I quote Ravaisson from his essay on drawing from 1854. Bodies, independently of their other properties, are all situated in space and all have a certain figure. The situations of figures result from relations of grandeurs, in other terms, of proportions. Now, as you probably remember, proportion makes, in fact, the fundament of habitudo. Could a figure then be what limits and refreshes, and at the same time, at the same moment, constituting a habitude by delineating and soaking up habitude's depth into things and bodies' approachable surface? Perhaps that could furnish a way, an inherently moral way, to do away with the dictatorship of images. Thank you very much for your
Thank you very much for a very, very clear presentation.
Oh, I tried.
Yes. No, I think it was very, very clear and also very relevant to our problems at hand. So, who can I ask who has a question for Adi? Yes.
You said that art history precedes art, so this first art history and then art? Can you clarify that? It seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah, I think in a way I think it returns also to several things that were brought up yesterday. I think that, and also before yesterday, I think that I would talk in very, very broad terms, very gross terms. So I would say history, but it's a very, very really general terms. I would better say philology or the sciences of the past. But I think that that was already very evident from Avenasian's first talk, that somehow our view of the formal, or the figural, or the visual, or the artistic, or yes, must today more and more take into account not historicity in the Heideggerian sense of the aletheia of truth and Ereignis of the Dasein, but in fact history in a much more regulated, habituated, habitudinal manner of thinking of appropriation of past actions and inscriptions collected by the human being as what it can carry with it. Always staying and sustaining a kind of a, you could say, constructed past reality. It is constructed because it is built on human acts. But it is still a reality, and it is still extended. And in that sense, at least in Cartesian sense, or Cartesian terms, we can say that it is also spatial, and therefore material. You see, so what I am trying to think about is this past reality, which is acquired, contracted, always carried by us in every moment, in every gesture, in every action, the most regular one, which in a way permeates, or is a kind of an a priori, a material a priori, extended a priori, a res extensa, upon which the res cogitans can work, can make it retroactively its own distinctions. And I think that it is possible to approach art. There are many available ways to approach today the problem of art, perhaps really this is the way to pronounce it, the problem of art. One of them is to say first there is always already a kind of a retroactive or retrograde, as Bergson would call it, movement of reminiscence, memory, acquisition, actualization, distinction, retroactive distinction, and then there are places in this res extensa which are things, and some of them are also artworks.
Okay. Other questions? Samuel.
It's just a very simple one. I would like to know what would your view be on Bourdieu's notion of habitus, and if you accept any of his ideas on his approach, then would and because you mentioned kind of a fixed dispositions or predispositions, then if there are fixed dispositions which through a systematic, let's say, way evolve, how does the new emerge? How does new things emerge?
No.
If you systemize them as, you know, past reality incorporated and then in a disposition?
Yeah, thank you for both questions. So first about Bourdieu. It's a story in itself. So you could say that my project, the book I am writing is in a way an alternative to the Bourdieu model of habitus. Most simply and basically because I think, also I don't want to say that, so first I think that one has to acknowledge that when Bourdieu starts to talk about this term in the 60s, he's actually playing a role, a part in a tradition which I'm trying to uncover. And this is this tradition which has about 200 or 300 years of developing this concept of habitude, habitus. And I think perhaps we should locate also Bourdieu on this line of thought. Now, on this line of thought, I think that Bourdieu effectuates a kind of a mistake. So if you go to Aristotle or to Thomas, it's true that, as I mentioned very briefly, so in the categories of Aristotle, there is a little bit ambivalence. It's not really clear also for scholars whether hexis is first and foremost a quality or a relation. So there are two separate categories, and hexis is mentioned by Aristotle in both categories. The scholastic tradition adopted the qualitative lead and went through this branch, and the relational understanding of habitude, habitudo, came into the fore only in the 18th, 19th century, and this is what I think. I think that the 19th century somehow conflated again these two possibilities. But even if habitus can be primarily also a case of relation, there is nothing suggesting, not in Aristotle and not in Thomas Aquinas, that it is primarily related to the social, in any manner. So if there is something, in a way, characterizing the concept of hexis habitus, is that it is a kind of a self-regime. It is a self-appropriation. It's true that there is a relation there, but it is not at all a conceptual, a sociological, communal concept. And now, just another little detail, so I will not lose the philological accuracy. One has to remember also that Bourdieu actually developed his concept of habitus after translating Panofsky's book on Gothic architecture and scholasticism. So it was actually Panofsky who did a kind of a switch in this concept of habit, suggesting it already as a historical tool, and Bourdieu joins the curve there. This is, and I don't think that there will be a big place for Bourdieu in my story. Like, now there was a second. What was the second? Well, no, not future, but new. The new, future and the new. Yes, I'm in a way, you could say that my position also regarding speculative and speculative realism, I think that realism for itself is a big enough task, actually. I'm not at all intrigued by the so-called promise of speculation. I think it is a huge mistake that this school takes today. Why? You know, we can go so far with realism. There is so much to do there. So why conflate it with again, really returning to Hegelian and German idealist questions and tendency? I don't understand that, but this is what is happening. My view is that there is a possibility, if the radical view that I want to propose, that I carry, that I try to think about, is a possibility to think only on the past, as equal and synonymous to the res extensa, and therefore as substantial, but not as time. It's not a time. And so the past is not a time, and about the future and the present, by the way, actually, the contemporary, I think it is derivative of questions coming still later from Heideggerianism. So Heidegger is the thinker of futurality, and even if it is a little gross and a little like stupid insistence, but I say no, I don't want no future. I don't care about the future, and I don't care about the new. There is so much. The past is so intensive, and so rich. We can work with it. So why are we so thirsty?
If you forget time.
Sorry.
If you say there's something that's what can be called as rate of change, okay, or speed of becoming, something that can be called as rate of change, not new or present or future or past, but something that is transforming in time, okay? Something that is changing in time.
Again, I didn't.
If there is something that can be called, and Deleuze calls it in some of his books, as a rate of change. A rate of change, a certain rate of change, a rhythm of change, a speed of becoming. Forget the word new. How does this occur? If we stay on in the past, or if we systematize the procedure of past into us, incorporate it, and then us, yeah, in the cycle.
Okay.
That's what I meant by new.
French for this change, no? Because it will give me some coordinate. I would say that so first, yes, of course, Deleuze is also a conceptualizer of habitude, both in Différence et Répétition and both in his book on Hume. Both elaborations are very important. From my point of view, trying to take back the spiritualist genre of thought to its roots, yes. Again, Deleuze is a late participant in this tradition for me. And yes, and so you would find his elaboration of the concept of habitude in the three syntheses of time. And it is the first synthesis. And so the very basic one. And then he has to add the second two. And I think that if you work with Ravaisson and with Biran, you could collapse the three stages or the three synthesis sizes in plural that Deleuze insists to separate from each other into the very simple act of habitude. About becoming, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, before we continue, I want to ask you a very quick question. Sorry, Samuel. And it is related to becoming, so I'm sorry to you as well. Because I wonder how art and history for you relate. If history is a kind of res extensa, as you said before, it's the material that rises up to the surface again to condense in a new artistic act, where it suggests that art always exists in actuality, or in some kind of asynchronous actuality, some kind of becoming. But what is art history then? The history of art? Is it really the history of art, or is it just the history of some material left over of art?
You went too far, perhaps in the last suggestion. Yes, I do think that. So I do relate to history as a res extensa. By the way, we are also trying to bring becoming into the res extensa. The res extensa is all about movement. By the way, let's not forget that in Descartes at least. It is always moving and.
Yes, but you make a distinction between an artistic appropriation of history and a non-artistic appropriation of history, I suppose.
I would say like that. It's a huge. Yes, I do agree. From different reasons, I do agree with Avenasian that poiesis is very important as a new category. And in that sense, I do think that, but from very different reasons to him. But I do think that when you go on the platform of poiesis, it is true that one reaches the point where it is difficult to say what makes a Rembrandt painting more heavy in my terms, with more meaning or intensity than a good designer store. For me, this is a real question. So what is produced is, for me, I respect it as such. Now comes the question of beauty, which doesn't conflate necessarily with aesthetics, by the way. And beauty can erupt actually everywhere, sometimes in art, and sometimes in art it doesn't at all happen, beauty, as we know today.
All right.
Something something like that.
Yes, thank you very much.